whakatakata hau ki te uru, whakatakata hau ki te tonga, kia mākina kina ki uta, kia mātaratara ki tai. E hiaki ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, tihei mauri ora. Tēnā koutou katoa, and nau mai haere mai ki te Māori and Antarctica Kamua Kamuri seminar series. And the intent of this seminar series is captured in that concept of Kamua Kamuri. It's walking backwards into the future. And that's the space we've tried to create here, a space where Hapu and Iwi can get informed and reflect on our history of connection to Antarctica and the Southern Ocean from a Te Ao Māori perspective. And based on that history, start thinking about our aspirations for what that connection could look like and should look like in the future. And then using those aspirations, thinking about what we need to be doing now to achieve them. And so that's a massive kaupapa, and there's lots of smaller kaupapa within it. And we hope that this seminar series, the website, and the research project more broadly, really creates a platform for Hapu and Iwi to be able to do that collectively. Ko Billy Van Utrecht tōku ingoa, no ahi te reiri ahau, no ngā rauru, tūhoi, me Ngāti Nīralanda ahau. So I'll be facilitating the seminars in the Wānanga, but I'm just one part of a much bigger team, and we're the Vision Mātauranga branch of the Ross Sea Region Research and Monitoring Program. And that's funded by the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, with the seminar series itself funded by Te Pūnaha Matatini. So we're a diverse team from iwi, Crown Research Institutes and universities, and even have Kayukan Athabaskan on board from Stanford University as a research intern, and we'll meet her a little bit later today. And I think you'll see that the complexity of the kaupapa is reflected in the team that we've sort of assembled. We all come at it from very different perspectives with the very different approaches, and that's kind of a necessary thing, and it's a strength that we draw on. As you follow throughout the seminar series, you'll get to know each of us. The only two of us left to introduce, oh, you already know me, but Bella will come on board at 3 p.m. this afternoon to be introduced, and then you'll know all of us. If you want to keep engaging with who we are or make contact with any of us, please just engage with the website. Pretty much everything's up there now, even all of the videos. And if you go to the YouTube channel that's attached to the website, you'll be able to find all of the videos from each seminar so far. So please engage there. So we've had we've had 6 seminars so far. And today we've got the final 2. Krushil Watene is going to be speaking now, and myself and Bella and Silla will wrap it up this afternoon. So I want to introduce Krushil a little bit, but not too much, because I'm sure she'll do it for herself. The first time I met Krushil was on a Skype chat while I was still in Aussie, talking about this kaupapa very, very explicitly. And we were all very useless at using Skype. And I think in a lot of ways we still are. But luckily for the benefit of the seminar series, we're all much better at it. So I might just pass over to you, Krushil, to introduce yourself and to introduce your kaupapa. I think it's a perfect timing. We talked yesterday at the end of Matt's seminar about how we needed your guidance on how to philosophize a little bit better, and hopefully you'll be doing that for us. You're shaking your head. But just to remind everyone too that it is a two-way conversation. So as soon as you have questions, and I'm hoping that you're all going to ask some really difficult, probing, philosophical questions that Krushil can engage in. I'm sure she'll ask you more questions back though in return, rather than answer any of them. Okay.
Can I just add something to E Hoama? If you have a question that you really want to ask in person, rather than using the chat, hopefully we'll have time for that. So see if you can find the little blue hand. You can put your hand up, and if you do that, we can actually unmute you so that you can ask your question in person if you really feel that that's the way that you'd like to ask your question.
Yeah.
So kia ora.
Cool. All right, I'll just pass over to you then, Krushil. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora tātou. Ko Krushil Watene tēnei e mihi atu nei. He uri no Ngāti Manu, te hikatu, Ngāti whātua ora kei me tonga. Ka hoki au ki te kaupapa o tēnei wā, tēnā rā tātou katoa. So, hi there. So I'm Krushil Watene, and I'm from the north, from Taitokero. Ngāti Manu in the Bay of Islands, Te Hikatu in the Hokianga, Whirinaki, and Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei here in Tāmaki or Auckland. And I also have connections to the Vava'u Islands group in Tonga. I'm part of the philosophy program here at Massey University based in Auckland, out here in Albany, where I'm zooming in from. So I feel very fortunate to be part of this wonderful team of people, I should say. And I'm especially grateful to Scylla for inviting me to join this team. A really big thank you to Billy for organising this series. I've enjoyed all of the talks so far and learned so much from everyone who's taken part. So what am I going to do? So what I don't have are slides, whānau, or pictures. What this will be just us having a kōrero together. So I hope that's okay with you all. So Antarctica is one of the most important and one of the most fascinating places on Earth. And we've heard some of the reasons why and how this is the case from our wonderful scientists already. And we've heard about their work and what they've learnt. But Antarctica is also fascinating for philosophers. And that's because it's a place that challenges many of our assumptions about what we value, and many of the processes and practices that fall out of those assumptions. So in other words, to put it another way, Antarctica challenges our perspectives. The place unsettles them, and in doing so provides us with opportunities to reimagine our lives together, to reimagine our relationships with the natural environment, and to rethink, most importantly, our responsibilities. So for instance, the standard approach or method we tend to use is to take our existing values and practices, grounded, for instance, in notions of ownership, the natural environment as a resource, and state interests, and then we transplant, the method is to transplant those ideas in Antarctica. So we see this method in the way that we frame decision-making and governance in Antarctica, which Billy will talk about later today. And this method and this approach roughly maps onto standard approaches in the likes of moral and political philosophy, which I'm interested in, at least in the dominant mainstream tradition. So on the standard approach to moral and political philosophy, we tend to begin with a story about human well-being. We try and think about what makes life worth living, what it is about human beings that makes us so important or gives us value. And then from there, we extend that approach as we need to. So to non-human animals, to other life forms, to people in different countries, to future generations, and so on, right? So from here, if we take this approach, Antarctica simply becomes another boundary to extend. We simply ask ourselves, and we simply need to ask ourselves, if we take this approach, how our existing concepts and ideas apply, thereby pushing the scope of our thinking. But I want to begin in a different place. I want to begin with a different question, and that's something more like this. What does Antarctica tell us about the limits of our current thinking? And how can Antarctica help us to reimagine our concepts and ideas anew? So today, and in line with these questions, I want to prompt some thinking and discussion around the deep reflection and transformative change that Antarctica challenges us as a global community to undertake. Both of these things, so the urgent need for change and deep reflection about our relationships with each other and the natural environment, are, I think, fundamental and fundamentally part of what I think our project is about, and which I think are beautifully depicted in the whakairo that we began the journey with. So if we just can look back for a second, how our ancestors storied a landscape and everything contained within it tells us many things. Not only do the stories capture important moments and events, not only do they tell us what our ancestors did and what they saw, but they tell us something really important about their perspective on things, about what they were thinking. And they tell us something about what our ancestors valued. In this regard, The whakairo is not only an important method for recording our concepts and ideas, our philosophy, but an important way of articulating what we're thinking, the challenges that we're facing, and an important way of demonstrating how we are storying ourselves into the natural environment, just as our ancestors have done. I think this highlights the beauty of Māori philosophy. So there's many ways that I think Māori philosophy is beautiful. And this is just one of the ways I'm going to talk about today, the first way. So I think Māori philosophy is beautiful in the way that it draws attention to and records the places where our lives with each other and the natural environment meet. It provides an account of the connections and relationships between people and all things, making sense of the world through these relationships, through these meeting points. Within such a framework, those of us familiar will say, well, no, this is a whakapapa framework that charts our relationships in descent and kinship layers. Within this framework, landscapes, seascapes, waterways, natural properties, and other creatures are ancestors and kin, each having their own importance in physical and spiritual terms, and each woven together. From such a starting point, all human beings, non-human animals, and the natural world have a common origin, history, and future. Because Māori philosophy in this beauty and in this beautiful way draws attention to these meeting places, it highlights the long-term significance of our interactions. So it draws attention to the way that our interactions can enhance and or diminish the quality of our relationships and our abilities and opportunities to relate in particular ways to each other. And we see the downside of constrained interactions, for instance, in the rigid processes and practices in our systems of governance and in our decision-making, in both method and in content, not just how we make decisions, but what we're making decisions about in Antarctica. This starting point that we find within Māori philosophy is vital to understanding how we ought to relate to each other and all parts of the network. These relationships determine not only access to resources and the philosophies relating to their use, which is important, but also the responsibilities that we have. So by mapping the relationships within which we stand, we're also mapping a system of responsibilities. And as we know, when we're talking about responsibilities and the responsibilities that fall out of this network of relationships, what we tend to be referring to are the ideas of things like manaakitanga and kaitiakitanga. So from a relationship-based perspective, we enhance our own lives by enhancing the lives of others, other human beings, other communities, non-human animals, and the natural world. Responsibilities on this view and responsibilities to others are at the same time responsibilities to ourselves. And that's because our mana makes sense, at least in part, in relation to the mana of others. By enhancing or diminishing the mana of others, I enhance or diminish my own. Here we acknowledge the interdependence of all things for well-being and the reciprocal relationships which exist between people and between people in the natural world. Kaitiakitanga frames these relationships and these responsibilities in terms of trusteeship and brings together a bundle of concepts, mana, tapu, rahui, manaki, that fit together in ways that shape and center collective responsibilities to protect and enhance socio-environmental relationships. Typically, though, across tribal landscapes, and we'll come back to this. I should say at this point that we find similar ideas in the philosophies of the Indigenous peoples elsewhere, of course. So for Mary Graham, Indigenous philosophies take, I quote, collective responsibility and obligation to look after land, family, and community as vital. What's more, reciprocal relationships lay at the heart of Aboriginal social arrangement, of law, and of ethics. For Anishinaabe scholar Amy Kraft, Anishinaabe law and treaty making is centrally about relationships and relationship building, understood to include quote, relationships among and between ourselves, as well as relationships with other beings. And Winona LaDuke emphasizes the way in which these relationships and responsibilities arise from a complex web of relationships. For Roger Marino, reciprocity, relationality, and, quote, a profound respect of the differences and an emphasis on the complementarities among human beings and between human beings and the natural environment is fundamental to the Quechua concept of sumak kosei. And similarly, for Rodriguez and Waldmuller, the concept of sumak kosei refers to a subjectively coherent integration between cosmic cycles, spiritual understanding, and animated mutual relationships of humans and nature in community. For these Indigenous scholars and activists, reciprocity, community, and relationality between human beings and in relation to all creatures and cycles of nature are central. Like the idea of kaitiakitanga, and like the importance of whakapapa, this complex web of relationships, these philosophies are grounded in a profound respect for our relationships and connections, and the importance of protecting them. So the second way that I think that Māori philosophy is beautiful is in its ability and commitment for transformation and innovation. And what do I mean by that? Well, what we know are that relationships, creativity, and innovation shape the history and growth of Māori philosophy itself. These ideas ground our Pacific Ocean voyages, including the kōrero we heard from Sandy Morrison and Amy Kaior on the first day, the growth of Māori knowledge, and the embedding or storying of that knowledge in the landscapes of this place, of Aotearoa, New Zealand. So when we're thinking about Māori philosophy, we're thinking about it as a body of knowledge that Polynesian ancestors brought with them to Aotearoa, New Zealand, and we're thinking about the knowledge gathered during our early life here, as well as our ongoing experiences and struggles, such as experiences of colonization. So earlier I talked about the whakairo and about how it carries our philosophy. And I also said that it's a wonderful example of how we are still storying our lives and landscapes. So Māori philosophy is also beautiful because it recognizes the way in which landscapes story us as well. I think this was beautifully articulated by Te Wārihi when he explains in the film that going to Antarctica was important because it was important to feel the place, to let it shape us, to listen and to learn from it. What we know is that our philosophies have traveled across geographical spaces, landscapes, and are woven through multiple generations of lived experiences within diverse social, political, cultural, economic, and natural environments. We know that our ideas can't just be planted into new ground. We know that they must be grown, sometimes in new ways, in ways appropriate for different places and for the opportunities and challenges that arise. So I would like to end with two questions. The first question follows on from what I've just said about the way that landscapes shape our concepts and ideas. So I understand that Billy and Scylla and Dan talked briefly about how Māori concepts might travel to and be grown within Antarctica. And I'd love for us all to talk more about this in the discussion. So here's the first prompt. What might kaitiakitanga look like in Antarctica? How would it be practiced? How would the bundle of concepts that this beautiful idea holds together, how would those concepts be arranged or rearranged in that place? And the second question relates to where we began, with the question of what does Antarctica tell us about the limits of our current thinking? So many of our mainstream assumptions about property ownership, about individual rights, and the notion of our environment as a resource without limit, we know that they're failing us under the weight of our contemporary realities. And we know that we need stronger foundations to take us into the future. We need pathways through which new ideas and fresh perspectives can be nurtured. And what we find within Māori and other Indigenous philosophies is potentially a rich heritage of stories and of storying. What we find are concepts and ideas that can provide us with a change in perspective at a time when fresh eyes and fresh thinking is so urgently required. The way we story ourselves and our landscapes either diminish or enhance our relationships. Jenny Lee at the University of Auckland, referring to the importance of pūrākau, reminds us that our stories have a grounding quality, that they ground our relationships and hold us all together. And Māori Marsden from the north says something similar when he recounts that the purpose of the Ngāpuhi Wānanga and the knowledge learnt there was always for the purpose of weaving the people together. So looking forward, and this is the second question, what stories should we leave behind for our descendants? And whose stories will they be? Kia ora tātou.
I'm coming back, Krushil. Wow. Thank you so much.
It's quite strange to talk to nobody.
Talk to a computer, it's really weird, isn't it? But that was amazing. Yeah, I think we've got a few questions popping up. But I just wanted to thank you for that, Krushil, for I guess, forcing us to really, really think on this, I guess, a level that I know that I certainly don't always think on. So it's really cool. So I've got a few questions here. Do you see relationality as different with regard to sea and landscapes, as in reflecting different atua? And how might this sit in Antarctica?
Is that from you, Silla? Kia ora, Silla.
That's from Silla.
Yeah, I think that kind of fits into exactly what I was saying, right? Where one of the challenges, I think, one of the reasons why Antarctica is so fascinating for philosophy is because it throws up all these kinds of challenges, right? We tend to think about landscapes in particular ways. We tend to think about our relationships in particular ways. And in some ways, we have to rethink these things anew, right? So one of the questions would be, what kinds of relationships would we have? How intimate would those relationships need to be for us to have responsibilities to Antarctica, right? Do we have to inhabit a place for relationships to grow, the kinds of relationships that lead to something like kaitiakitanga and the beautiful responsibilities and concepts within that? And I'd like to say that so I'm always of the mind that our tupuna gave us threads and concepts that we can use to face any challenges that arise, right? And so I think the question that they leave us is, how can they be used? How can they be transformed in new places? What will that mean about our relationships with these places? And what kinds of responsibilities will fall out of it? So I think that's really the question.
Cool. I guess I wanted to build on that. Do you think there is an element of the thinking? So if we always need to think anew, what elements of the thinking do we keep at what elements are fundamental and which elements are sort of able to be transformed?
That's such a good question, right? Because I mean, if we think about, I think about that a lot too. I think we've talked about this before. So like when we think about Pacific voyaging, we know that when we got to Aotearoa, New Zealand, the concepts that we brought with us had to be sort of regrown in new ways, right? And there's a question that, what is it that holds that continuous thread around the Pacific and elsewhere, right? What is it that holds us all together? And so I think there's a framing that holds us all together, a particular perspective, which I was talking about, right? That holds all of this together, which is recognizably part of the fabric of our philosophical traditions, our wider Pacific philosophical traditions. Yeah. So if there's one thing, it's the framing, the perspective that we have. Yeah.
Cool.
Hey, Billy, are you able to give Peter Barrett the mic? He's got come in with a question that he'd like to ask.
Did you want to ask Ocean's question?
No, here's one from Peter. So he says, I'm not sure how best to frame this, and it's quite a big problem, but I just need to say it because it's urgent. I and many others are concerned at scientists showing that Antarctic ice sheets begun to melt. This is happening on account of rising greenhouse emissions, largely CO2 from fossil fuels. This will affect climate and sea level profoundly for future generations. So what is the Māori perspective on this?
That depends on what you mean. So that seems like there's lots of ways one could take that question. If the question is something like, is the way in which we produce and consume problematic for future generations of Māori, for our landscapes, then that's yes. Does that harm our relationships with each other in the natural environment? Yes. Should we produce and consume much better? Yes, we should. But let me add, our Māori communities, so for instance, my own Māori northern communities in Taitokero, are they working all the time to do these things? Absolutely. Do they need space to be able to do these things better? Absolutely. Do we need to recognize the work that they're doing? Absolutely. But kia ora, I feel like that's the only way I could answer that question, sorry.
Cool. We've got a few coming in now. Ocean Mercia suggests whakapapa might inform us on the scope of our kaitiakitanga responsibilities. What is our whakapapa to landscapes, seascapes, liminal scapes in Antarctica?
Yeah, so actually there's a paper that, if I can say the Scylla, that we're putting together that traces these things, that Scylla's the lead author on. Scylla, would you like to say something about that paper?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, you just keep going, bud.
No, I didn't want to. So Billy's also been doing a lot of research. I just didn't want to sort of take the...
No, you go. I'll chip in.
Yeah, so absolutely. So Billy did lots of research for us about mapping the different ways in which we might relate based on different species, on the ocean itself as connecting us, voyaging. But also what's really interesting is the science that happens, especially the Māori science, that they're storying also that landscape, which I think is really interesting in giving us connections, different kinds of connections too. So absolutely, it's quite exciting about this network, this kind of innovations and kind of understanding this complex network of relationships that we have. And that's the beauty, I think, of Māori philosophy, and particularly whakapapa, for providing us with a framework for thinking about these things in really useful and really beautiful ways. Yeah.
Actually, I will just chip in really briefly.
Well, you know.
Well, just to build on that, so one of the really cool things, for example, is if we were to think about whales. So whales pop up all the time in Māori stories, but if you think of it as well from a scientific point of view, whales move from Tonga and from the sort of islands in the Pacific. They go right down to the Antarctic to feed and then move back again. So you can actually think then about whakapapa that extends between people and whales, but also in the landscapes that both people and whales move in, and then think about the connections that way as well. So there's all sorts of really interesting kind of echoes or conversations that you can see kind of moving backwards and forwards.
Mm. Kia ora, Scylla.
Cool. We've got a question from Ursula. How can these concepts, etc., be communicated with other cultures, like Asian concepts of environment and relationships? There are so many different cultures now in Antarctica working and living. So I guess just reflecting on, it's an international space with lots of different cultures coming together. How do we balance between these different threads and concepts of environmental ethic, I guess?
Yeah, I think I heard a couple of questions in that. Let me just try and. So one of the things I think is so this idea of how do we communicate these concepts. I feel like the real question is, how is it that we can create an environment and space for other people to listen, right? not just to listen to the landscapes, right, and Antarctica and what we can learn from it, but from other voices, right? That's what's missing. I think that's really essential to this project too, about the missing voices in these conversations that that we're having about a place, right? But also, absolutely, there's so many voices that we ought to include. I mean, so many philosophical traditions, so many communities that have really useful and really valuable and really rich kōrero concepts and ideas to bring to this. So I think, yeah.
Yeah, cool. And I think it's a follow-up from Ursula. Do you think it would be possible to protect species here in New Zealand that Antarctic migratory species depend on to enrich the kaitiakitanga of the Antarctic ecosystem? Example, orca might travel between New Zealand and Antarctica. Are there food resources that they prey on here in New Zealand that could be given protection with our EEZ?
That's really fascinating, actually. I love that question. That's really interesting. Yeah, I think that would be a really, so Scylla was already talking about sort of the migration of whales and different species, and I think that would be such a rich and powerful way of connecting in the way that Ocean was asking about, sort of understanding and innovating our ideas about our complex relationships. So yeah, no, I think that's a brilliant idea, actually. Kia ora.
Actually, it's really fascinating too, because I know that some of the orca, the killer whales around Kaikoura, do go down to Antarctica and back. And so some of Ngaita who have been involved with Whale Watch, they're now starting to think about those connections as well. So I think this is a really important question, and how we do think about kaitiakitanga and where the limits of it lie. Or yeah, if we're thinking about relationality, how do we discriminate, you know, between our kin? Yeah, it's really fascinating.
Daniela's got a question. I might just pop. Kia ora, Daniela. She thanks you for the wonderful and very thought-provoking presentation, Krushil. Your presentation beautifully highlights why we need more philosophers to engage with Antarctica. Do you have any thoughts on why only so few philosophers have engaged with this concept of Antarctica as a topic for their research? And she can only think of a handful of environmental and political philosophers who have focused on Antarctica.
Yeah, that's true. I'm not sure why that is. You know, apart from, it's really interesting in one way, because often moral and political philosophers think about, you know, thought experiments that they've imagined, which are useful to imagine too. But what we have is a place, a real place that can do that work for us. So I don't know why philosophers have not yet engaged with Antarctica, and I'd love, like you, I think it's important that they do start to reconsider what we have reason to value and what we ought to do, and how that might shape their thinking.
I wouldn't mind following up on that. Do you think that from Te Ao Māori perspective, do you think philosophy is far more ingrained in the way that we sort of think about things? Or
what do you mean by that, Billy?
I guess if we're thinking that philosophers aren't really engaging in the Antarctic landscape, do you think from a Te Ao Māori perspective that would be an issue? We should be having philosophers more at the fore in terms of defining and thinking about our relationship to landscape.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Still not sure what that question is, but let me try and answer one. I think we do this anyway, right? I think philosophy, I think just thinking about how we began this project with the whakairo, philosophy is part of what we do, and philosophy is essentially part of what we do and how we think and what we value within our natural environments, right? So if the question is it more likely that we'd get Māori philosophers talking about Antarctica? I think our Māori scientists do anyway, right? So yes. Is it a issue of methodology maybe, where non-Māori philosophers just are not used to looking into the ground to grow ideas, to see how ideas grow within a landscape? Maybe that too. Yeah.
Cool.
I hope I answered your question. I'm sorry.
I think so. I think that it gets to the point of it. Is I think the fact that Tuarahi is such a you know, he's this tohunga, and he brings this sort of philosophical perspective just inherently to the kaupapa. And I think that's been very fundamental to this research approach. We recognize that philosophy is really, really important to shape our thinking, whether that's reflected in other scientific programs, or is it an artifact of, you know, the very Tau Māori sort of approach that we're taking?
Yeah, I suppose one question might be then, what role scientists ought to play in this sort of values space, in their practice, for instance, right? And their basic assumptions about the work that they do. That would be a really interesting question too. Given that often it's the scientists in Antarctica that are storying the landscapes.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
There's a question about what role and what responsibility they might have down there.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so we're pretty good on time. Might wrap it up there then, Krushil. Scylla, did you have any final comments?
Come on, Billy. This is so fascinating. I'd really like to see if there's anyone else who's got questions. It can be, oh, Sandy's got a comment. Awesome.
Yeah.
Yoda, thanks. Thanks very much, Krushil. That was really, you know, very moving to kind of hear your thoughts. I think one of the issues that we as humans have is that we haven't had continuous human occupation of the Antarctica. And when you don't have continuous human occupation, the first thing I feel that needs to be done is to find our association to place conceptually and practically and physically. Having said that, no ethnicity and no country has had that long-standing human occupation. So we all kind of start from that similar kind of footing. But in finding our sense of place, for us it's whakapapa, and I guess that was pretty pivotal to the work that Amy and I did, because as we move around the country, we've heard some amazing stories about associations that have long been forgotten. And so it's, you know, really about finding those again and acknowledging that we have this association with place. But even beyond that, our trust in the natural universe says that the atua were there regardless of any humans being present. And so it's acknowledging that. And I think that what we can do is kind of recover some of those stories. Like, for example, I've heard a story from Chile where the Andes Mountains carries all the way down to the Antarctica, and that's the association with place. Amy talks about the Southern Alps going all the way down there as well. So even those are our whakapapa to the oceans, to the mountains, to everything that exists. And that would be my response to oceans question. So let's just feel confident that we can name an association to place. We're recording what some of those associations are, and we're still getting stories from other hapu and other iwi and other whānau as well. And I think that our role is to make sure that regardless of a treaty relationship or whatever, but the sacred power of our atua is known to everybody who works down there, and that we will continue to collaborate and reorient, you know, for the greater well-being of what our responsibility is as kaitiaki. So I did hear the comment, and I'm sorry I couldn't be on some of the previous sessions about our concepts travelling. From my point of view, they were there, and I told the story in my presentation about an ancient ngiri, and that says that Huiterangi Ora, as a reptilian creature, has been living there for 66 million years. It's just all kind of way back, right? So they're there. Yeah, so I think, yeah, we just need to feel confidence that our stories are there, and part of our journey here is just to make them more valid and more visible and more alive. And pivot their meaning to what are some of the contemporary challenges that we've got now, and being clear that we will be engaging and furthering that engagement.
Kia ora, Sandy. That was really fascinating and rather beautiful, actually. Yeah, I wonder. So one of the things I often wonder is, because as a philosopher, I want to critically engage with the things that I think about. So one of the things I think about is what role the human has to play in these concepts, actually. How prominent that role needs to be for there to be a connection, a relationship, and a responsibility to a place. I don't know. I'm still thinking that through, but I think it's fascinating. That's what I think is the beauty of Māori philosophy. Yeah.
And I just note from Ursula the 2 permanent settlements down there as well. So thanks for that, Ursula. That's really good to know. And there's the collective intelligence that we're building and growing as well.
Kia ora, yeah.
Actually, the other part that I found really interesting from Jack's talk yesterday was he was also talking about the fishing boats that go down every year. And in his experience, half of the people probably on those fishing boats are Māori and Pacifica, which again speaks to this through the generations, this continual reconnection with seascape, with the sea and the land. So I found that really fascinating too.
Yeah, my whānau in Te Tauihu, because they're on the Sea Lord's boats, and with them while I was talking with the Kapaka group, they've got all of those stories about going down there and, you know, just being part of all of those teams. But of course, you know, Ngāi Tahu has a strong association with the fishing as well. So, and those still stories, right? You know, so this morning I was on Te Ao Tapatahi, and they asked about, you know, these kind of similar questions, and so we have been backwards and to and fro, but we just haven't kind of recorded them. The other thing I wanted to say, just in relation to that human aspect, is when we look at the navigation, that waka is the vehicle for carrying humans, but in it they carry in a different sense of wairua and tapu and mauri as well. So it's a spiritual carrier as well, and so you know, you can't take the waka away from all of those journeys that occurred anyway. And I believe that traditionally we would have all of those karakia, and whatever the term is, it was like a talisman of tapu was on, and that was to ensure that the journey was going to be safe and all of those things. So while we've talked about travel there, the actual spirit in the way that the journey happens should not be discounted as well. And they all come together because it's all working together.
Cool. We've got a question from Victoria come in. Sorry, Victoria. Amazing presentation, Krushil. How can we marry philosophy and science more in this space? I liked your comments about values. Scientists tend to say we don't use them in science, but we know that is not true. Is there a role of philosophy in identifying and acknowledging the Antarctic and Antarctic science values?
Absolutely, but I also feel like there are so many awesome scientists here who are already doing some of that mahi, who might be able to answer about their practice and how it informs their practice, how values inform their practice, and what further role philosophers might have in that space. Is there anyone out there that would like to share their kōrero about their scientific practice?
Looking at you, Pete Russell. I can just make one comment while everyone's getting their thoughts together. One of the really cool things that James, when James and Potama went to Antarctica and they created their whakairo, was, you know, because they'd come to us and said, oh, do you want us to carve anything in particular? And I said, no. I said, absolutely not, because I think really this is not about scientists telling you what to do. It's about a generative process that comes from you. But what was really interesting is when they went down to Antarctica, and there was a lot of discussion back and forward between them, and you can see in the whakairo some of the patterns and some of the snow ridges. There's all sorts of ways in which the science is incorporated into the philosophical approach and the art and the knowledge that they were placing within the whakairo. And you can see it as well in the two manaia that James carved on the ends of the pare. So in the little booklet, which we've now added online to the website, he talks about how those manaia represent both the partnership of Ngāi Tahu and Ngāti Wai, but also the partnership between Indigenous peoples and environmental sciences, and how that we're coming together with shared values. So I just wanted to chuck that in the discussion as well.
Kia ora, Pete, did you want to chip in, bud?
Yeah, kia ora Krushil, great kōrero. Yeah, just, you know, we've been working a little bit, and we've written a paper with Craig Stevens this year about mātauranga and oceanography. And, you know, and this is a question that people come up with, you know, more recently quite often. And I went to a talk about, a couple of years ago, that Hotu Barclay Kerr was giving, and he was talking about Papa Mo Paling, who was, you know, one of those original navigators that got the, you know, the revival of navigation going again. And Papa Mo, so Hotu was recounting this time when Papa Mo was over with a whole lot of NASA scientists, and one of the scientists asked Papa Mo, said, how do you know the Earth is round? You know, how did you know the Earth was round? And Papa Mo said, well, the moon is round and the sun is round, so perhaps the Earth is round. And, you know, for me, that sort of encapsulated mātauranga. Okay, you know, it's fairly observational, but, you know, just in its essence, you know, I suppose the scientists at the time wanted some sort of answer like what, you know, Pythagoras might have given, you know, to do with angles or stuff like that. But yeah, so, you know, marrying philosophy with science, to me, you know, there's some things that are almost intuitive or instinctive, particularly if you do have a relationship with, like a relationship with the sea, for example. You know, I think, who was it yesterday? Jack talked about fishermen being scientists. They spend that much time on the water. They have an intuition and just a complete feel for what's going on around them. And, you know, their lives depend on it as well. So it's a fairly, you know, deep intuition that they have. Yeah. So, you know, maybe that adds to it for you, Krushil.
Awesome. Brilliant. Kia ora, Pete.
We've got Peter Barrett. Sorry, Peter, I missed your question before. He says, thanks for your response previously, Krushil. He was thinking more along the lines of Māori science compared with Western science. And he says, as a Western scientist, I'm finding Western science is sound, but not very effective in a wider community. Maybe the wider Māori perspective could help?
Absolutely, yes, of course. And I think, again, there are plenty of wonderful scientists here who are doing that mahi really well, and who could speak to that at this point better than I can. But yes, absolutely.
Yeah. How would you, I guess it's talking about Māori science and Western science. I think what Peter's is getting at is the, you know, Māori science sort of encapsulates philosophy a little bit more than what we traditionally think science does. And I think in my training as a scientist, I never really engaged with philosophy. in any of that, only through my own sort of curiosities and a few academics who really pushed me on that front, like the philosophy of biology in particular. And I wonder if any of the other scientists on the panel had that same sort of experience, where the philosophy underpins your scientific practice, or not.
I'm just going to vote that I think philosophy of science should be a compulsory part of every science degree. I think it's immensely useful because, as I think one of the other Pete's said earlier, often as scientists we are taught traditionally to take values out of the work that we do, but actually values are really integral to how we go forward and the legacy that we leave for future generations. So yes, we can do work, but placing that work within context is actually an incredibly important thing to do. And I think with Antarctic work, when we think about the marine protected area, when we think about what our legacy is for future generations in terms of not just Antarctic science, but how we protect the planet. I mean, all of these things are critical. I can just see another question come in from Ursula. So how can young Māori who can't get to the level of tertiary education become engaged? So I'm not sure if you mean engaged in science. So she's put that question to all of the panelists. And I'd also say to anybody who would like to speak to that in our audience as well, do raise your hand if you'd like to actually speak.
Kia ora, Sandy.
Well, kapahaka, you know, I think that there's many kind of targeted forum that we find Māori at, right? And so we use the example of kapahaka in our form of engagement with young people because it's absolutely such a phenomenon. But you've also got our marae meetings, you know, where young people are hanging out, and I find that many of our iwi have a stronger focus on education to support STEM. So it's about identifying what local Māori into, what is it that they're absolutely passionate about that's contextualised to their area where that engagement can first happen. Kura kaupapa, the kōhanga reo kids, they've already been ingrained within a strong sense of looking after the environment, of doing karakia for the environment, of talking about the weather as tāwhiri mātia and ranginui, you know, so they've already got a really good head start.
So I think, so Ursula's just clarified a bit and said with Antarctic science, and she mentions there seems to be a focus on those already at university level. So I think you've spoken a bit about that, Sandy, but I think also in terms of Antarctic science specifically, and again to add to what Sandy's saying, it's about if there's a framework that resonates with people, that is such a powerful way of communicating. So if it's whakairo, if it's kapahaka. So I think it's about taking science or Antarctic science out of a little box, out of words on a page, and doing the thinking and doing some of the work within frameworks that actually resonate with people. And, you know, in my experience, that's really powerful.
So Marianne has asked a question. It's a bit of a long one, Krushil, so there's probably a few questions in it. Perhaps our contemporary use of the word kaitiaki is also tempered by notions of validating for legislative interest what a role is. But in the stories, Indigenous peoples acknowledge an energetic imprint that lasts beyond a physical body presence. So whales have stories or songs, a reo, a knowledge, understanding, and genetic memory of our spiritual relationships, which have existed beyond our memories. They also have stories of place.
Oh yeah, that's beautiful. I think that's, you know, what's really important about that comment, I think it was, is that we have to be really careful where our concepts and our ideas are used in policy and legislation where that policy and legislation starts to redefine those concepts. I think we have to be really careful about that. I think you make a beautiful point about how that takes place and how we have to remember what it is, the underlying values that inform these concepts. Kia ora, yeah.
Cool. Any other questions? Any other pātai whānau? See any coming through? Any of the panelists wanted to have a kōrero?
I was going to say, I think that's a beautiful place to stop, because I can see that it's 4 minutes to 2, and so some of us will need to rush off. But just to remind everybody, we would love to hear your comments. There's an online wānanga for whānau, hapu iwi, in a couple of weeks' time. I think it's August the 12th. We would really love you to come along and have your say. So if you're able to go away from the series, take your whakaaro, get other people to watch the seminars, because they're all on the website. Yeah, we'd like to hear you come back with your ideas about Māori engagement and aspirations in the space of Antarctica. So anyway, Billy, over to you. I think there's a final comment.
We might wrap it up there because we are pushing close to the hour. Thank you so much, Krushil, for your kōrero. Obviously stimulating for everybody, and forcing us to think a bit more high level than I think most certainly I do. So we'll just finish up with a karakia. Thank you again, Krushil, and we'll come back at 3 p.m. For the final seminar, which will feature myself and Bella, and yeah, we'll just wrap it up and get a big picture of the kaupapa. Okay, unihia, unihia. Unihia ki tūru tapunui. Kia wātea, kia māmā te ngākau. Te tinana, te wairoa i te ara takatā. Ko ia rai rongo, whakairia ake ki runga. Kia tīna, humi e, tāi ki e. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora whānau.